Well, each week we've entered our exhortations with an exploration about some Christian responsibility or godly society. And today, let's talk about morality. Morality. Now, if you're going to talk about morality, there's a biblical hierarchy which is critical for Christians to keep in mind. It's a hierarchy moderns rarely appreciate. But the Bible points to this hierarchy persistently. It's the hierarchy of law and government. Law and government. Now, if you don't remember from school, hierarchy means what is over what controls what, and what made what. Kind of chicken and egg kind of things. We moderns tend to think that governments make laws. It's kind of axiomatic when from your college civics course to your grade school social studies course to the first time you heard about it in kindergarten class, we teach this everywhere. What's the government? It's in charge. What does it do? It makes laws. But in the Bible, the hierarchy is completely reversed. As God formed his chosen society, what does he start with? Why, we look and we see Mount Sinai. God started with law. Not till 300 years later and more does God actually start to make a government, a centralized government, a king. The government in God's chosen society doesn't make laws, it keeps laws. Here, Deuteronomy 17. When a king sits on the throne of his kingdom, that king shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book. This was said 300 years before there was a king. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord, to be careful to observe all the words of this law, and that his heart may be never lifted up against his countrymen. How does that apply to us? Well, in a Christian understanding, if I might need a volunteer. Chuck, may I use you? If I go to Chuck Bentley and I take his pocket knife, a bottle of his shampoo, and his wife's knitting needles, I would be a thief. Now, say the government does it, and the moderns tend to call it TSA, because the government made a law for it. But for the biblical Christian, that's still called theft, because the law comes before the government. In a Christian understanding, if a larger person dressed in a white gown knowingly kills a littler person, that man is a murderer. Now, say the government does it. Moderns suddenly call it abortion, because the government made a law for it. But for the biblical Christian, it's still called murder because the law makes the government. In a Christian understanding, if one man listens to another who tells him to cease honoring God, that man would be a blasphemer. In the Bible, something worse than being a murderer. Now, if the government does it, moderns tend to call it state education or shelter in place, because the government made a law for it. But for the Christian, still blasphemy, because the law makes the government. Do you see why hierarchy is central here? Hierarchy is central here. Seeing, preaching, and governing according to this hierarchy, rightly conceived, of law over government, is ancient. The Hebrews called this hierarchy righteousness. Early Christians called it virtue. Samuel Rutherford made the phrase lex rex, and Frederick Bastiat, the rule of law. Our present day name for it tends to be morality. Morality. Not a biblical name, but it will do. It'll do if we understand the Bible. We understand morality biblically. The government does not create what is right and what is wrong. God does. Governments enforce what's right and wrong, or fail to. And I must follow the government when it is doing right and punishing wrong, or I sin. But when the government doesn't, I may not follow. You see, when we topple this hierarchy and say the government makes laws, and Romans 13 says, well, you better obey those laws, we start allowing ourselves a permission to sin. And we comfort our conscience the whole time by saying, well, we're just obeying the authorities. What can you do? But if, in the biblical mindset, the governing authorities are beneath the law, then using the government to break the law is simply doing what the Bible tells you never, never to do. Do not put your trust in princes. We can modernize that. Do not put your trust in governments. And what does God say to those who do in Isaiah? Those who lead you have caused you to err, and the Lord will arise and contend and judge you. Wait, I was just following my leaders. That's the problem. God save us from that. For all the times we have allowed ourselves to follow our leaders into sins, God save us from it. For all the times that we have allowed ourselves to do what was legal, but what was immoral. Or not done what was moral, but instead followed an ordinance or a regulation or some other word of man. If that has ever happened, now is our time to confess.